World Economic Forum recently wrapped up its meeting in Switzerland, where billionaires and world leaders discussed their plans and priorities for the coming years. The meeting brought into focus the WEF's initiatives, including its cooperation with the United Nations on Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030 to reshape the world. We speak with Alex Newman, a journalist and public speaker who's been investigating these programs, about the World Economic Forum and its plans and the United Nations Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. We also speak about how the World Health Organization's pandemic treaty has been rolling out and its upcoming meetings to try to advance its powers.
Hey, Alex Newman, thanks for being on Crossroads.
Thanks very much for having me. Great to be with you, Josh.
So, Alex, we have two of the major world power meetings just happened, another one in process. This is the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, Pandemic Treaty, and now the Bilderberg meeting. And I understand that you've covered a lot of these quite extensively. And I want to talk to you about kind of what is being said at these meetings, what's actually going on with them. Is it, are people just being conspiracy theorists thinking there's something nefarious? What's happening? Let's start by talking about the World Health Organization meeting, because a lot of the news reports were that basically the World Health Organization was going to get powers to, basically manage local politics on pandemics. What happened with that meeting?
Well, one of the interesting things about the World Health Organization is it's incredibly opaque. It is very, very difficult to find out exactly what happened, and that's by design. They do that on purpose. They don't want reporters in there snooping around and figuring out what's going on. But I did talk to the State Department. I did talk to the World Health Organization's communications people, and I interviewed a lot of people who were following this closely. In fact, I just published an article at the epochtimes.com, and I think it'll be in the print issue, about what happened. And it seems like the Biden administration had submitted a slate of 13 amendments for consideration earlier this year. And those amendments would have really empowered the WHO and especially the Director General quite significantly. I think the biggest change would have been that the World Health Organization's Director General would not need the consent of the nation or the government being targeted to declare a pandemic or a health emergency of international concern. And the implications of that would have been quite significant, because when the WHO makes those kinds of declarations, the wheels start turning on a whole range of things. And I mean, on the extreme end, we see things like we saw in the Ivory Coast during the Obama administration, where under the leadership of Margaret Chan, very, very friendly with the Communist Party of China, the WHO declared a pandemic that was going on in Western Africa, and the Obama administration actually sent troops to go help enforce what really I think can only be described as medical martial law there. And so that was with the consent of the government. Now, what would happen if those types of things could happen without the consent of the government? Well, we know that the people running the WHO are not exactly liberty-minded, Constitution-respecting American citizens. The current chief, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, is a very close ally of Communist China. He was actually on the Politburo of an ethno-Marxist terrorist organization, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and then he served as the right-hand man for really a very brutal dictator in Ethiopia. So these powers would be very dangerous. Now, they did get dealt a defeat, a temporary setback, if you will, at the WHO meeting. Some of the African governments, some of the South American governments, especially the Brazilian government, really resisted, as I understand. But, and this is the main point of the article that I wrote, these people are not going away. It's not like, oh, we lost, and so I guess we'll just go back home and we'll do something different. Absolutely not. I talked to Dr. Francis Boyle. He's a professor of international law at the University of Illinois. He actually wrote the implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention, passed unanimously by Congress. And what he said is he thinks they're going to just try to roll these amendments into the International Pandemic Treaty that they're going to be working on this summer. And several other experts that I spoke with said even if they can't get it into the Pandemic Treaty, they're going to try. And if they can't, they'll just be resubmitting similar amendments in September when the next round of amendments is due. So the threat is definitely not over, Josh. And I think this very clearly is an attack on the national sovereignty of nations and the ability of peoples to govern themselves.
Yeah, well, crazy stuff. One question I was getting from a lot of my viewers was, well, can't the United States block this? Won't the United States, how can they enforce the United States? And I was actually shocked to see that a lot of the really bad amendments actually came from the Biden administration, including the one that would allow them to basically bypass local governments in different countries in order to declare pandemics, and also removed any need to have like an official, evidence-based declaration where Tedros could basically just declare things based on whatever information he wanted. Those actually came from the Biden administration, and I was shocked to see that. Now, I know these African nations, Brazil, they blocked these things from getting passed. Was anything passed at this that we know of?
Yeah, and again, it's so difficult to figure out what's going on. I tried my best to make sense of the documents that were released, but I did finally hear from the State Department and the World Health Organization, and my understanding is that they adopted a handful of what I think are really relatively minor changes. The one that they're considering the big step forward here is one that implements changes to the international health regulations in 12 months rather than the traditional 24 months that it was before. And they also approved the creation of a new working group to draft and consider new amendments. Those will be coming due at the end of September to be considered first in November and then in the next World Health Assembly session. So they did make changes. Now the media, Reuters and Politico and some of the other major media presented this as kind of a first step in ultimately achieving the end goal of the Biden administration, which were these much broader changes. When I talked to James Roguski, he's one of the independent researchers who really has been sounding the alarm about this for weeks on end now. He portrayed this as a total and utter defeat for the Biden administration, but he also acknowledged that they're not going to be done with this. They're going to be trying and trying and trying until they manage to make these kinds of changes.
Well, and I was shocked actually to see kind of the two-faced narratives of a lot of the mainstream media, where on one side they were claiming that anybody saying that this was even real was a conspiracy theorist, and the other side they're reporting on it and acknowledging that it's taking place and that these are actually happening. Like these two-faced lies they tell, it's so deceptive. On the note of the upcoming meetings, is it going to be the same amendments that we just dodged, basically presented again, or do you know if there's anything new? And also, is that, if these get blocked in September, by September, does that mean they're going to keep trying, or is it like another 4 years or whatever?
Well, officially, we don't know what's going to be in the new amendments. Officially, they're going back to the drawing board and they're going to be drafting new ones. But the big immediate item coming up, Josh, is the International Pandemic Treaty. Now, we do have a lot of insight into what they're working on here. Dr. Tedros has very publicly spoken on this issue. He is calling very openly, by the way. There's no conspiracy and there's no theory. Dr. Tedros and others have been very open about their desire to see vast new powers for the World Health Organization. They want to become the central coordinating mechanism for all international health issues. And so they've said explicitly they would like to have the ability to sanction nations that don't cooperate with the WHO agenda. Dr. Tedros has talked about that. They've talked about their battle against misinformation. They've been very open about the fact that they're working with the technology companies. In fact, the Epoch Times and some of your videos have been victims of this on YouTube and other places, where the CEO of YouTube actually came out publicly early on during the CCP virus pandemic and said, hey, if it goes contrary to what the World Health Organization is recommending, it's going to be a violation of our policy and we're going to be removing it. So they've been very open about their desire to entrench these things. And that's going to be the big one. In fact, the World Health Organization put together what they call an independent panel for pandemic preparedness. This was chaired or co-chaired by Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand. And if you look at the documents that they put out, if you look at the public statements that they have made, again, they're not being shy about the fact that they want vast new powers for the WHO. They sometimes couch it in language that's a little bit misleading. They say they want the WHO to have political and financial independence. That's just another way of saying they don't want national governments to be able to interfere with what's going on there. And I think when you look at the big picture, when you look at the statements that they are making, when you look at the proposals that have come out publicly, the European Union has already indicated that it supports this agenda as well. They're talking about really turning the WHO into a kind of global health ministry. Kind of like every nation has its own health ministry. We've got the Department of Health and Human Services, the CDC. They want the WHO to take on that role, but for the entire planet. And one of the things that keeps coming up over and over, Josh, that I think really helps show the scope of this is they're calling everything a public health emergency now. They're saying that racism is a public health crisis. Yeah. They're saying that climate change is a public health crisis. They're saying that gun violence is a public health crisis. And so if everything is a public health crisis and the WHO is the primary mechanism for dealing with health crises, then pretty much everything comes under the jurisdiction of the WHO. And again, they've been very clear about this. Nobody has to speculate or theorize. Just go read what they're saying.
Well, yeah, the implications of that could be horrifying. Not to mention that even in the United States, and they started up this new Office of Environmental Justice, I believe also under the Health Department. And so if they can talk about environmental justice, actually briefly, if you could tell us, because I understand this has all these weird race implications as well. They're basically just what you said. They're trying to expand health crisis to basically be a target on anything that's not Marxism. It's what it looks like. Yeah, it's wild.
It's exactly what it is, Josh. I tell people anything that they don't like, any institution that they want to tear down, they simply just refer to it with the magic word racism or white supremacy or systemic racism, and suddenly that institution, basically any institution that they don't control, becomes a target. And so we're seeing now multiple states moving forward with this idea that racism is a public health crisis. And of course, today, in the minds of these people, racism means something very, very different than it did just 5 or 10 years ago. The idea of hating a person for their ethnic background or whatever, it's a totally different word now, and that's some of the games that they play. Of course, the idea that climate change is a public health crisis, well, they're arguing that climate change is caused by human emissions of CO2. There's no human activity that doesn't emit CO2. In fact, you exhale about 2 pounds of it every day. In other words, every single human activity would then fall under the rubric of contributing to a global public health crisis. And of course, gun violence too. They've been very open. I mean, the CDC has now said multiple times over the last few years, all the way up to the director, that gun violence is a public health crisis, needs to be treated as a public health crisis. So this really would be the camel's nose under the tent for, in my opinion, very draconian controls over essentially every area of life.
I want to go into WE, World Economic Forum, and some other stuff. But first, one thing my viewers always ask, can we do anything about it? What do you recommend?
Well, there are a lot of things being done about it right now, Josh. That's one of the things that I think they weren't expecting when they went into this World Health Organization meeting. These things are usually very opaque events. Very few people actually pay attention to this. The media usually ignores it, and they like it that way. They don't want people talking about what they're doing because they're doing things that they know people would not approve of. And so I think they were taken by surprise this time around that you had at the state and the federal level very significant actions being taken to rein this in. Now, I want to start off with the constitutional questions, and multiple lawmakers and legal experts have pointed this out. This stuff is not constitutional. The federal government doesn't have the authority to run your health care or determine what kind of policies need to be implemented on health care. Read Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It lists all the powers of Congress. All legislative powers are reserved to Congress. These are not federal powers. And so if they don't have these powers themselves, they certainly can't delegate those to other parties, whether that be the World Health Organization or anybody else. And this is absolutely clear in the case law. I mean, Thomas Jefferson made this case. Back in the 1800s, there were cases. Even in 1957, Reed versus Covert, the U.S. Supreme Court said that the government could not delegate new powers to itself just by signing treaties. Second of all, there's some real questions about whether the Biden administration is even planning to submit this as a treaty. In fact, I was at the UN climate conference during the Obama administration in Paris, and the Obama administration negotiated what can only be described as a treaty, and then they came back and said, well, it's not a treaty. It's just an executive agreement. It's an addendum to previous treaties. They've already been ratified. And so he started implementing that with executive orders, executive memoranda, presidential decrees, and just using the regulatory apparatus to implement these things that he had agreed to. So constitution or no constitution, they plan to move forward. But as far as what is happening in opposition, we've got at the state level, multiple states now, lawmakers all across the country are in discussions about how they can block this. The Kansas State Senate actually just passed a resolution saying it strongly disapproves of these WHO machinations, that they're unconstitutional and that they will not be accepted. And in fact, I talked to some lawmakers here in Florida. They said they're willing to implement and adopt legislation that would say no state or local employee of the government of Florida or any subdivision, so the county or local governments, can participate in any way in the enforcement of these WHO decrees, mandates, recommendations, whatever they end up being called. And at the federal level, we had the entire House Freedom Caucus sent a letter to the Biden administration saying, look, this is all illegitimate. You need to get us out of the WHO. You need to go after this corruption. We had multiple senators working on this. Senator Steve Daines of Montana. In fact, a senator from Florida, my state, Senator Rick Scott, introduced legislation saying that the WHO may not control American policy when it comes to health care, that policy needs to be developed in America by Americans. You've got now legislation to defund the World Trade or the World Health Organization. Just got dozens of new co-sponsors. That's in the House of Representatives. So they're trying to move quickly with this agenda before the opposition gains a critical mass, but it's building very rapidly. And I think if people are opposed to this, one of the obvious things to do would be to get in touch with your elected officials at the state and federal level and let them know that you expect them to be working on solutions to defang this really what in my view and the view of many experts that I've talked to is an unconstitutional program. In fact, I talked to Dr. Robert Malone, the man who broke the internet when he went on Joe Rogan's podcast. He said this is an impeachable offense by Joe Biden. There's no way that he can do this legitimately, and it must be stopped.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Alex, every time something like totalitarian is on the horizon, we find the Constitution blocks. The Constitution was so well drafted that the foresight of the founding fathers is incredible.
Yes, it was.
Let's go into World Economic Forum. I'm sure some of you saw the video, for example, where Jack Posobiec, another reporter, was actually detained briefly by the World Economic Forum police, and they had World Economic Forum police patches. And then the media unanimously claimed it was disinformation to claim that they have a police force, which there's some nuances to it. So don't believe your lying eyes. But it did bring a lot of attention to the World Economic Forum and what the heck they were talking about. Alex, I've heard some mixed things about WEF. On one side, I've heard that, basically it's just like a club and it doesn't have any regulatory power. It doesn't have any real significance. I've heard the other side that basically they run most governments around the world. What's the reality with this?
Well, I think it's somewhere in between, right? It's certainly not nothing. It's certainly not an irrelevant organization. It's an incredibly powerful organization, partly because it pools the resources of governments, major corporations, thought leaders, university professors, and things like that, and kind of gets them all working toward the same objective. And so in that sense, it's an incredibly powerful institution in and of itself. Now, it's true, it doesn't possess its own regulatory powers. It doesn't possess its own authority to actually make things happen. But it has the ability to bring together this huge coalition. They refer to themselves as stakeholders. They're all stakeholders, governments, corporations, special interest groups.
That's their favorite word. They want stakeholder capitalism, where the stakeholders, i.e. them, control capitalism.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's what they're moving toward right now. They really want to completely reshape the global economy toward this idea of stakeholder capitalism. And part of what that means, they want to switch over to this model of environmental and social and governance, this ESG metric, where, in my view, it's very fascistic, right? In a free market system, companies have an obligation to serve their shareholders, and they have an obligation to serve their customers. That's how they make money and serve their shareholders. And so companies have an incentive to do things that are productive, to do them efficiently, to do things that people want done, and to do them in a way that doesn't violate the law, that doesn't infringe on the rights of anybody else, because then they'll end up in a lawsuit losing shareholder money. And so that's not a good use of shareholder money. And so that has created more wealth than any other system or non-system in all of human history. I mean, we saw the prosperity levels in America absolutely explode beyond anything that humanity had ever seen in a very brief period of just a couple of centuries. Historically speaking, that's a very small window. And so that system has served us very well. But the World Economic Forum, as part of this broader global agenda that they're referring to as the Great Reset, they want to completely restructure the global economic system. They're saying that pursuit of shareholder value is by accident maybe, but still happening, destroying the environment, destroying human rights, destroying social justice. And so we need to reshape the entire system. And that's one of their big agendas. And I think that's one of the roles that they're playing. They're bringing all these very influential corporations and governments to the table. And we were talking about this a little bit before we went live, Josh, and that is the implementation of the UN's Agenda 2030. The WEF actually years ago came out and openly partnered with the United Nations in bringing the business community to the table on the implementation of Agenda 2030, which really is a radical plan to restructure every element of life that goes right in with the Great Reset that World Economic Forum Klaus Schwab is peddling and has been peddling for some time. So clearly it's a significant organization. It's not, a smoky room, shadowy club that secretly runs the world. I don't think that's an accurate perspective, either for World Economic Forum or even for Bilderberg. But to suggest that it doesn't have any power, that it's just kind of a sideshow, a club for people to have fun, that really downplays it in a way that I think is not accurate.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that, I mean, they have their videos publicly. You and I, a bit before, talked about watching George Soros' speech, actually. I actually saw one of the videos, and this is what brought up the issue of United Nations and how it relates to them, was I saw a video and they were saying that they were going to partner with the United Nations on Agenda 21. And I mentioned that to you, and you said, oh, yeah, they did that a long time ago, actually. And that was news to me. And then that they've also partnered on Agenda 2030. Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030, I hear a lot of mixed information. Some of it I look into and it turns out to not be true. Some I look into and it is true. What are these programs and how does the World Economic Forum fit into this?
Well, they're incredibly significant international agreements. Now, the Agenda 21 that was adopted back in 1992, George H.W. Bush, supposedly representing America, went down there and negotiated with all the governments of the world. This was at the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio. This massive agreement. I mean, it's hundreds of pages. You can read it. I encourage you to if you find the time. Agenda 2030 is much smaller, and we'll talk about that. But by their own statements, this is an agenda to completely reshape the world and every element of it. It's divided up into different chapters. And Chapter 36, for example, deals with education, and they tell you that they need to change the values, attitudes, and beliefs of all children using the education system, that it has to include spiritual development, that the Sustainable Development Agenda needs to be interspersed and interwoven into every subject area in school. And so the way they market this is that it's just an environmental agreement. It's just designed to make the planet sustainable. Now, they have hundreds of different ways that they define sustainability, but the general gist is that we need to make sure that we don't overconsume resources so that at some point in the future generations will also have access to resources. And I'm sure there was a lot of focus group studies and ways to come up with ingenious plans for marketing this in ways that sounded non-threatening. But when you really drill down into this, they are talking about the undermining of private property rights. They're talking about the undermining of the free market system. And they're talking about shifting more and more power and authority to international institutions, especially institutions that are part of the United Nations system, the UN, the World Health Organization, and all the various specialized agencies, many of which are literally run by agents of Communist China, members of the Communist Party of China. So we have this problem. And again, people can find this document. There's no conspiracy theory. The support for it has been very bipartisan. Bush signed it. Nancy Pelosi drafted legislation to help implement it. Bill Clinton came out with an executive order mandating that sustainability be considered by every federal agency in all of their policy decisions. So it's a real thing. It's been moving forward for a long time. I actually have the children's edition of Agenda 21 where you really get a sense of where this is ultimately going. In 2012, I went down to the 20th anniversary summit. It was the UN Conference on Sustainable Development 20 years after the original. They called it the Rio Plus 20. And they kind of doubled down on this agenda. Incidentally, the whole event was chaired by a member of the Communist Party of China, Xia Zhakun, very anti-American fellow, totalitarian-minded. That's Agenda 21. It's a plan to totally restructure human society. Now, Agenda 2030, this was much more recent, much shorter as well. You could probably read the whole thing if you're a fast reader in 20, 30 minutes, if not, maybe an hour. Much simpler document, but still they give away the agenda. Now, Agenda 2030 has been compared to Agenda 21 because they deal with the same things, but Agenda 21 really focuses down on the local level. They're trying to get the local governments, the county governments, they call them the subnational governments, on board with implementing this, and that's one of the things that Clinton did. Agenda 2030 takes a much bigger approach. It looks at nations, regional governments like the European Union, and then the role of the United Nations and the architecture of global governance and all this. But I do encourage people to go read that. It becomes very clear what the agenda is. If you go to Goal 10, for example, they tell you that wealth redistribution within countries is no longer enough, that we now need wealth redistribution among countries. So they want to basically take money from the middle class and supposedly the wealthy in America and redistribute that via the United Nations to governments in what they call less developed countries or least developed countries. So we are quite literally talking about global wealth redistribution. And they talk about bringing in universal health care for all. They talk about reproductive health care, by which they mean abortions. They talk about vaccines for all. They talk about saving the world from climate change. It is a very significant document. Now, the World Economic Forum has partnered with the UN in their words, to bring the business community on board here. And so I think that's one of the big roles that they're playing. But one of the things that I found most interesting, that I think your viewers will find most interesting, Josh, is that right after Agenda 2030 was adopted and approved by governments around the world, not as a treaty, it wasn't properly ratified as a treaty by our U.S. Senate, but all the governments of the world, including the Obama administration at the time, signed on. The Communist Party of China actually came out, and through all of its propaganda organs, they started putting out public statements that Beijing played what they described as a crucial role in developing Agenda 2030. And as you read the document, I think that will become very apparent. This is not modeled on the ideas and principles that America was founded on. In fact, it bears much closer resemblance to the type of government and the model of governance that we see in communist China.
Thank you, Alex. Really great description. Best one I've heard, actually, detailing what they're up to. We only have about a minute left, but I want to talk about the Bilderberg group meeting because, I mean, World Health Organization was, people were kind of worried about it. WEF, maybe less people knew about it, but arguably more power with it. Now Bilderberg, which is so opaque, I think most people don't know anything about it or hardly anything about it. But they're having their meeting right now, and this is a meeting of all these world leaders. And about a minute left. I mean, what is Bilderberg, and is there anything we should be paying attention to as this meeting takes place?
Yeah, Bilderberg is incredibly significant. It's only in recent years that they've finally admitted that they exist, and they put up a website and they put out press releases now. I don't think it's as significant as a lot of people make it out to be. I don't think it's the shadowy cabal that runs the world or anything like that. But they do important. I mean, you do have very, very influential people who are self-proclaimed globalists, internationalists, and they seem to vet people there. So not everybody who goes to Bilderberg is some powerhouse in their own right, but they do seem to vet people. Prime Minister Tony Blair, before he became prime minister, popped up there. Bill Clinton, before he became president, popped up there. All the heads of the European Union, before they became heads of the European Union, popped up there. So they almost seem to do kind of like job descriptions. I've been to two of them, obviously as a reporter, never as an invited guest, for obvious reasons. It is a very significant group, but it is also very opaque. So a lot of what comes out of there, from the commentary is just speculation. Very few people have sources that'll reveal stuff from there, but it is important. People should keep their eye on it, and they've been very clear over the years in their public statements. Their agenda is global governance, as they describe it, supposedly for our own good, but I think people need to be very wary.
Hey, Alex Newman, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Josh.